Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of the Our Voices podcast. I'm your host, Kristin Kalbli. Well, friends, you heard it right. This is the final episode of the Our Voices podcast. After deep reflection over the past several weeks, I have decided it is time to close this chapter and see what life has in store for me next. So today, it's just me and a microphone talking to you, the listeners. I hope you'll stay with me as I share a little of the wisdom I've accumulated over the years of producing this podcast and over a decade of learning and healing from my own experience in a mixed orientation marriage. This final episode is my gift to you, my loyal and mighty audience, in gratitude for your support, your attention, and your time over the last 8 years. But first, I want to reflect on how this podcast came to be at all and what it has meant to me. In 2018, I was still reeling from the revelation that my ex-husband, whom I'd already been divorced from for 7 years, was gay. After our divorce, he'd remarried another woman, and it was she who eventually reached out to me with the truth. In that moment of her disclosure, I finally understood the hidden dynamic that had doomed my marriage. And while I was deeply grateful to her for that essential clarity, I was also consumed by rage at the years I lost, at the lies that were told, and the emotional and psychological harm of living in my ex-husband's closet. From that place of pain, the idea for a podcast was born, a space for straight spouses in mixed orientation marriages to LGBT people to share our stories. I had no idea how to create a podcast, but I was determined to figure it out. I reached out to Stephanie Schuyler, then executive director of the Straight Spouse Network, and asked if she could find funding to hire an audio engineer, and I would do the rest. I called it the Straight Spouse Voices Podcast. The first season was an intense learning curve. I had to figure out podcast logistics from scratch, seek advice, hire an engineer, and learn about microphones and recording software. Back then, ready-made podcast starter kits didn't exist. Our first engineer was the husband of a friend of mine. We recorded in the spare bedroom of their Florida apartment, improvising soundproofing by piling couch cushions against the windows. We were over the moon if the podcast reached 100 downloads in a month. At the time, that was considered a success. Since those humble beginnings, what is now the Our Voices podcast has become a truly global platform. With nearly 250,000 downloads across 100 episodes, this podcast ranks in the top 10 to 15% of podcasts simply by downloads alone. Listeners have tuned in from around the world, the United States, the UK, Ireland, Australia, and continental Europe, of course, but also India, China, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Colombia, Uruguay, and Nigeria. And nothing could match my surprise when I saw that even a trickle of downloads came from Pakistan, Iraq, Bahrain, Malaysia, and Ghana. The Our Voices podcast has been my mission for the past 8 years. It gave me a sense of purpose that helped me climb out of my own deep well of confusion and grief. This podcast was my way of offering hope and understanding to others who had experienced what I had. In that sense, every episode is deeply personal to me, and I am profoundly proud of this body of work. It has been an honor and a privilege to bring you this resource. There are still many guests I never had the chance to interview, and countless topics left uncovered. For every guest I featured, there were 1 or 2 more I researched but couldn't schedule. For every topic we explored, there are 5 more that deserve attention. This work is never truly done. And that is part of why my decision to step away is so difficult. But a few months ago, I attended a charity benefit at the very hotel where my wedding reception was held 26 years ago. I hadn't been back to the hotel since that day, and I took a quiet moment to sneak into the empty ballroom. I saw where my then husband and I sat at dinner, where the band played, where we shared our first dance, and where we cut the cake. I was just 23 years old when we married. I could see hopeful 23-year-old me in her white satin dress, doing her best to navigate a world so full of hidden truths she couldn't possibly have known what was gunning for her. It is far too late for me to lean across the bridal table and whisper to her to run like hell. But if I could talk to her now, I would tell her that I have done everything in my power in the 3 decades since to make sure her light and grit and spirit were restored and honored. I was 19 when I started dating my ex-husband. In December of last year, I turned 50. All told, this story has shaped more than 30 years of my life, well over half. And that is more than enough. Before I go, I'd like to leave you with some of the wisdom I've collected over the years from a few of the writers, thinkers, and teachers that provided me with a roadmap to healing. I believe many of you will relate to this. Years after my divorce, I found myself trapped in a liminal state. I beat myself up for taking so long to heal. I told myself to get my shit together. People get divorced all the time. They move on all the time. Why was I any different? But I ruminated and fixated on what happened to me. And the vibrant life I longed for remained elusive. I experienced bouts of existential depression, anxiety, and panic. Emotionally, I had healed at the margins only, and I wondered if I would ever truly come back to life. If you can relate to this state of liminality, I'm hoping today will be rousing, bracing, and motivating for you. A St. Crispin's Day speech of sorts for those of you who may be feeling stuck in your healing, or for whom progress towards a new life is slow, or moving forward is fraught with setbacks. If you're in a headspace where a bit of cheerleading feels like hollow positivity and frankly annoying, I get it, and this may not be your day for this. But if you are in need of some championing, some encouragement, a bit of a dare, and maybe even a little kick in the ass, then this is meant for you. I searched everywhere for guidance for getting unstuck. I made a second home of the self-help aisle at Barnes & Noble. I read book after book, hoping to find salvation within. I took psychedelics. I sat at the feet of a South American shaman, a Tibetan lama, and a Hindu guru. I devoured the teachings of enlightenment yogis, consciousness teachers, depth psychologists, and meditation instructors, hoping one of them would tell me what the fuck was wrong with me so I could fix it. Because I believed if I fixed it, nothing like that would ever happen to me again. I joined a cult. I left the cult. I poured out my heart to various therapists, trying to uncover the fatal flaw in me that made me so unlovable, all so I could figure out how to heal once and for all and finally live my life. If you're listening today, it might be because you're wondering the same thing. How do you move forward when you suddenly find yourself on a path you never wanted to walk? The truth is, life comes for us all. Many times, in fact, during the course of it. We know this intellectually, that something or someone is going to get us somewhere sometime. We know that none of us gets out of this thing alive. There's a divorce, a diagnosis, a job loss, a bankruptcy, a death, or 1,000 other possible derailments. Sooner or later, the life path you followed and faithfully served, the one that should have worked to get you where you thought you were going, where you thought you wanted to go, didn't work. In fact, it led you somewhere you never intended to be. And now, here you are, unmoored, destabilized, and drowning. In the book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, How to Finally Really Grow Up, Jungian analyst James Hollis reminds us, no amount of good intentions, conscientious intelligence, forethought, planning, prayer, or guidance from others can spare us these periodic encounters with confusion, disorientation, depression, disappointment in ourselves and others, and dissolution of the plans and stratagems that seemed to work before. James Hollis is the principal wisdom teacher I will be paraphrasing and quoting from today, among many others, so bear with me because I do love a good quote. We know from all the great cultural myths that our greatest challenges contain within them our most profound opportunities. Luke Skywalker would never have left Tatooine if he hadn't lost everything. Because catastrophe offers us an invitation. Hollis calls this moment when our old life collapses the summons of the soul. He uses the word soul not in the religious sense, but as the stand-in for the ancient Greek word psyche. The summons of the soul is a crisis that invites us to step into the fire, Hollis says, and burn away what was never truly ours, so we can go discover what is. It is a call to examine the script we've been living by and begin deconstructing it. What role do we play in our own dramas, he asks us. Are we the protagonist, or merely a bit character in someone else's script? And if so, what is that script? And whose story is it? My own answer was painfully clear at the time I found out the truth. I had been a supporting character in my ex-husband's play for nearly 2 decades by then. Isn't it time for your own story? Hollis presses us. Because if we don't find our own story, we will end up serving someone else's. As a 23-year-old bride, I had been following a script. The college to marriage to house to kids to aspirational middle-class lifestyle script. My divorce was a brick in the face. It made me look at all of it. What I discovered was that the script, the value system I had been living by, had been handed to me by my culture, my family of origin, and my conditioning. It wasn't mine. As mythologist Joseph Campbell put it, we can spend decades climbing a ladder, only to realize too late that we have placed it against the wrong wall. I had placed my ladder against the wrong wall. It's hard to describe the ongoing, persistent existential panic that accompanies such a realization, but I'm sure I don't have to describe it for many of you, because you're in the great reckoning now. You're waking up to the fact that your ladder has been against the wrong wall. You might be in resistance. You might be insisting that, no, this is my wall, damn it, and I will die trying to get my ladder back against this wall. Or you may be slowly beginning to accept it was never your wall. Or even if it was, you're going to have to get a new one regardless. Because the truth is, we only have 2 choices from here: to fight the reckoning or to take it up. If we take up the reckoning, that is, if we answer the summons of the psyche, we enter what Hollis calls the swamplands, or what 16th century Spanish mystic John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, or what the Bible calls wandering in the desert. It doesn't sound fun, no matter what it's called in any myth tradition. And speaking as one who has traveled this murky existential path, it isn't fun. But neither is living in post-collapse purgatory. I suspect many of you know this purgatory well. The life you knew is gone, and it's not coming back. The life that awaits, the new normal, has yet to take shape, and you're left there in a chronic low-grade panic, wondering if it ever will. Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, imprisoned by the fascist regime in 1926, wrote, "The old is dying, and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." Many of you listening today are deep in the interregnum of morbid symptoms. If you are in the throes of post-disclosure or discovery survival mode, you know the sleepless nights spent wondering if you will stay together or get divorced, if you can keep the house, or where you'll live now if you can't, if your kids will be okay, if you can survive seeing them only half as much, if you'll be able to support yourself, if the stress will break you. You know the white-knuckle panic of waking up to an overdue bill, a letter from your ex's lawyer, or the sinking feeling that your boss has noticed you're falling apart at work. You've driven yourself mad trying to strike an impossible balance, supporting your spouse while trying to meet even a fraction of your own needs. You cry in the car after dropping the kids off at school. You talk to your therapist who, if you're lucky, sees your side of things. You cycle through grief for what was lost, disorientation over where you are, and fear over what lies ahead. If you're further along in this process, perhaps you know the malaise of depression and the angst of dissatisfaction with how your life has turned out. When you look at your life now, perhaps it doesn't look anything like what you thought or hoped it would. Perhaps the grief never left. Perhaps there is no new vision to spur you to action. Perhaps there is a sense of powerlessness over what happened to you, over the denial of justice, over the fact that you didn't get a say. I know I carried rage at my ex for a long while, years if I'm honest. I wanted to take all my pain, package it up, and send it back to him so he could carry it instead. What happened to me was cruel and unjust, yes. How could I heal without justice? Justice I was probably never going to get. But I was so attached to my fantasy of justice and my righteous position as my ex's victim, it was a long time before I could see the larger opportunity in front of me. I want to take a moment here to say this is not about to be an invalidation of the rightness, the necessity even, of adopting a victim story for a time. Frankly, our victim stories and our anger are essential for future boundary building. So I'm not here to browbeat you into bypassing your pain and anger when you most need to feel it. This is not your time for this message. And this is definitely not an admonishment of people who are still reeling from fresh discovery or disclosure and are fighting through shock for daily survival. I'm not here to bully you when you most need compassion. This is not your time for this message either. I'm talking directly to those of you, and you know who you are, who are sick and tired of being sick and tired. What if we recognize this moment in our lives for what it could be? An initiation by fire. The very lostness and stagnation you feel right now is the door, not a punishment. In the midst of these psychological dislocations, Hollis says, we cannot imagine there could be some enlarging purpose arising from our suffering. Often, much later, we recognize that something was moving us purposefully, initiating a new phase of our journey, though it certainly didn't feel like it at the time. It is generally through the experience of unsolicited suffering that we grow larger. Only when it hurts too much to deny it any longer can we reclaim our lives from our history. There is no healing without suffering, no relief without compensatory cost, no salvation without first visiting hell. Or, as author Regina Thomasauer wrote, what if rupture is the only ticket to rapture? It sucks. That's what. None of us wants rupture. Who in their right mind chooses hell? Frankly, when hell comes knocking, understandably, most of us run as fast as we can in the opposite direction. Even if it is, as Hollis says, the normal thing to do. It's quite natural, he says, to cling to the known world and fear the unknown. But for those willing to stand in the heat of the transformational fire, the second half of life provides a shot at getting themselves back again. Anxiety over the unknown is the price of our ticket to life. Depression is the product of our refusal to climb aboard. The ego has a tendency to prefer security over development and wind up with neither. But accepting the journey will free our energy to serve the agenda of life, the agenda of growth. The challenge is always more enlivening than the comfort zone. The agitation and disquiet of growth is preferable to the diminishment of safety and miserable familiarity. In other words, the way I interpret this is, allow the death that wants to happen to happen. Your new life is going to cost you your old one. Sooner or later, Hollis says, we have to be willing to face our lives. It takes a great deal of psychological honesty to be able to look directly at our sorrow and take responsibility for the personal task that has now emerged. So, my friends, you are hereby on notice. This is your Luke Skywalker moment. Are you going to leave Tatooine with Obi-Wan or not? I told you today was going to be a bit of a kick in the ass. Because what we choose from here says a lot about who we are. As friend of the show Cam Isaac said in his recent TEDx talk, you learn who you are at the bottom. Are you going to stay in a familiar wasteland or choose the complete unknown with a shot at whatever it is life has to offer next? Because if we do not consciously choose to go, our conditioning and patterns will choose for us, and we'll end up right where we were with our ladder back against the wrong wall, and depression or illness will result. For those of us for whom depression has been a regular companion, Hollis tells us that depression is the psyche's protest when we are serving an agenda other than the agenda of the soul. It is a sign that something is old, dying out, and needs to be released. Depression heralds something new that wants to come into our lives, and perhaps we are not letting it. The writer Andrew Solomon said, "The opposite of depression is not happiness, it's vitality." So depression prompts us towards the dark night of the soul, towards the reckoning. So we have a shot at vitality on the other side. So we have a shot at becoming a truer version of ourselves on the other side. To dare us further, Hollis asks us, why is now the time, if ever it is to happen, for you to answer the summons of the soul, the invitation to a second, larger life? I know for me, the words larger life hit me between the eyes when I read them. Yes, I thought, that's it. I want a larger life. A larger life than the small, scared, angry, desperate one I had been living. The depressed, constricted life that served as poor compensation for all the loss. The measure of our personal development will hinge on two factors, Hollis says: our willingness to accept responsibility for finding our own myth, and our ability to sustain the ambiguity that always precedes a new experience of meaning. For the goal of life is not happiness, but meaning. Life will still have its way with us, friends, again and again. It will jolt us sideways and surprise us with the unexpected, good, bad, and ugly. Commit to life anyway. Embrace, or at least tolerate, ambiguity and the unknown, because they are always pathways to growth. Complacency is the enemy. Grit is your friend. Choose the obstacle, my friends, because the obstacle is the path. In fact, ride out to meet it, because the safe and familiar leads to stagnation and regression. Be afraid and start anyway. Show up and start anyway. Do it anyway. To quote Kafka, move into the house instead of admiring it. Even now, in my own life, I am facing a crossroads where I'm having to coax myself into the ambiguity and discomfort of the unknown yet again. But if I drag my feet or refuse altogether, I know I'm just going to end up rotting on top of a mountain of unlived creativity. And I don't choose that. One of my teachers had a mantra I will never forget. Here, now, this lifetime. What unlived creativity longs to be born or expressed through you here, now, this lifetime? Unlived creativity wilts the soul. Stop betraying yourself by denying it's in there waiting to get out. We both know it is. Seriously, stop. Let's not repeat the patterns of denial and suppression that shattered our lives before and landed us here. We already know where denial and suppression lead. We've been their collateral damage. Instead, let's give room to our unlived creativity and our unexpressed voices. It serves no one to keep these gifts at bay. Not you, not me, not our communities, not the world. If ever there was a moment to unleash our still unexpressed creativity and possibility in service to the world, it is now. What I'm really trying to say with all of this today is, okay, this happened to you. Now what? I'm not asking you anything I haven't asked myself again and again. I'm not asking you anything I am still not asking myself and will ask myself as many times as is necessary. This happened to us. It sucked. Now what? Make up your mind that it doesn't end here. Make up your mind that you're still going to have a good life, even if that's not right now, even if you can't see the path forward, even if right now it's a total shit show. If it's a shit show right now, let the Buddhist mantra, chop wood, carry water, be your mantra. Put your head down, chop wood, carry water. And keep chopping wood and carrying water until one day you happen to look up and see a bird sitting on a spring branch. I know this is fucking hard. I'm not saying this from my loft on Easy Street. I've clawed my way upright again and again after my divorce when subsequent life stumbles and falls laid me flat again. I've been in the hospital twice for major depressive episodes, and that doesn't count the ones I haven't been in the hospital for. I've scraped the pieces of my shattered mental health out of the dirt more times than I can count since then, determined above all else to grab messy vitality with both my hands. And by God, I will keep doing it as many times as I have to. Because guess what? We don't choose a larger life once and magically get it. We don't choose vitality once and magically get it. We have to keep choosing them. We have to keep believing joy, vibrance, and love are our natural state of existence and our birthright. I'm not saying I have the answers. In my experience, there are no answers. Not really. There are only choices. So make them. As Yogi Berra astutely advised, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Yes, it is a risk to take the fork, but it is a risk not to take it. So you might as well choose your hard with open eyes. I'm not saying this as if I've somehow found the magic formula and I'm currently living the dream. I am not living the dream. But I'll tell you what else I'm not living. I'm not living the lie. I'm not living my ex's lie or mine. Remember how I came face to face with the realization that I had put my ladder against the wrong wall? It was a damn good thing my divorce knocked me off it, because in my ignorance and youth, I would have given my all to keep climbing that ladder. To use another metaphor, the gift in the ashes of my marriage was learning that the house I had burned down wasn't really mine anyway, any more than it was his. If Hollis is right, that there is no salvation without first visiting hell, then at least hell has a purpose. My life is undoubtedly much less conventional, much richer, and more varied than it would have been if I'd followed the script straight to middle-class normality. I am undoubtedly a much richer person with more empathy and compassion for myself and others. I have more resilience and depth, more awareness of my own truth as well as my own bullshit. My personal values have been sharply clarified, my instincts honed, my intuition louder, all because of how I grew and grew up after my marriage and divorce. Ironically, that makes my ex-husband one of my biggest teachers, because the relationship I've built with myself is a direct response to what he showed me about myself. He showed me that I didn't trust myself, so I taught myself how to do that. He showed me that I didn't have boundaries, so I taught myself how to have those. He showed me that I lacked self-worth, so I taught myself how to find it. He showed me that I was not in charge of my own life, so I taught myself how to take command. And he showed me that I wasn't being properly loved, so I taught myself what that feels like, that it really is possible, and that I am worthy of it. As poet Galway Kinnell wrote, "Sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness." So that's what I did. Reteach yourself your own loveliness. Do whatever you have to learn to trust yourself again. Do whatever you have to reclaim your inherent dignity and worth. Let this crucible hone you to live with intention, purpose, and integrity. Paulo Coelho said, "Maybe the journey isn't about becoming anything. Maybe it's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you, so that you can be who you were meant to be in the first place." Who were you meant to be? We get many lives. The one we lived before all of this happened, and the one right here, right now. We may not have been entirely responsible for how we got here, but we are responsible for what we choose from here. There is so much more of the world and life beyond this thing that happened to us, and I hope that one day our lives will be so large that the rupture that brought us all together becomes just another fact about our lives among many, not a feature. Have courage, take heart, never give up on joy, adventure, vibrance. Never give up the hope that life can deliver on some dreams, if not all. I will end with a poem by Finn Butler. It's been making the rounds on social media, and a beloved sweet friend, sent it to me not too long ago, and it seems appropriate now. Everyone who terrifies you is 65% water, and everyone you love is made of stardust. And I know sometimes you cannot even breathe deeply, and the night sky is no home. And you have cried yourself to sleep enough times that you are down to your last 2%. But nothing is infinite, not even loss. You are made of the sea and the stars, and one day you are going to find yourself again. There are several people I must thank before I go. I want to thank the Straight Spouse Network, now Our Path, our founder, Amity Pierce Buxton, and all the past and current board members for your continued support of this podcast. I want to thank Stephanie Schuyler Hench, the then executive director of Straight Spouse Network, who agreed to fund that first episode and start us on this journey. I want to thank Kelly Holloman, the former executive director of Our Path, for unfailingly championing me every step of the way, always trusting my instincts and judgment. I want to thank the current executive director, Allison Joy, for her continued support of this podcast. I need to thank the donors. You made this podcast possible, period. Funding is a constant concern in the podcast space, even when you have as many downloads as we do, because we are not monetized. Contrary to what many believe, podcasting is not a revenue-generating endeavor, except for a tiny minority of shows with extremely large audiences, and often definitely not for a niche nonprofit podcast. Because of your generosity, we've been able to keep this resource free for all who need it and never had to take it behind a paywall. I need to thank my engineers and editors. There was the OG, Brian, who helped me get this podcast off the ground. In the beginning, it was just Brian and me in the trenches, teaching ourselves how to do this and praying the lawn company wasn't mowing on recording days. I want to thank our engineer and editor now, Drew at Play Audio Agency, as well as the studio manager, Anne. You guys have been fantastic. You let me keep recording my content when I suspect many other studios would have long ago shown me the door. We could talk to any guest we wanted, cover any topic we wanted, and say anything we wanted without hesitation or fear. I want to thank all the guests who have come on the show. I value and appreciate your stories and perspectives, and I am grateful to each of you for sharing yours in the common goal of helping straight spouses gain insight into our journeys. We've had illuminating, honest, and sometimes challenging conversations, and I've learned something from every one of you. And finally, I need to thank you, the listeners, for your time, attention, and support. You are the reason this podcast exists at all. It's been a great 8 years. If you're interested in staying in contact with me, you can friend me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and Substack, although all those spaces are simply placeholders for coming attractions. If you've heard me talk about my book, The Mercy Fake, the story of one fake marriage, lots of fake orgasms, and the search for what's real, you can head on over to the Facebook page for The Mercy Fake and like it. Any news I have pertaining to the book will be announced there. Hopefully, you will be seeing more from me on that in the coming year. I'll put all those links in the show notes, along with a link to James Hollis's book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, which I highly recommend. If you've listened this far, I have just one more request. Pay it forward. Because we are each other's best chance for healing. For many of us, apologies or closure never come. Even with advocacy, those who haven't experienced mixed orientation marriage will never care as deeply about this topic as those of us who have. There will never be enough acknowledgement or validation from the outside world to make everything okay. Hope, but don't rely on the world to understand us. Instead, support each other, heal each other. I encourage some of you to consider volunteering for Our Path or other organizations doing similar work. As I record this, Our Path urgently needs board members, staff, volunteer support contacts, group leaders, and donations to keep the lights on and continue serving straight spouses. There are many roles to fill, and the work is far from done. I also hope for a return to what old-timers know as gatherings. Once upon a time, there were gatherings across the country, including an epic annual gathering in Treasure Island, Florida, if you know, that went on for years. Shout out to Marianne for her Herculean efforts organizing those events. I was lucky to attend a few times, and I'll never forget dancing like a fool on the beach under a tent with hundreds of other people who just got it without my having to say a word. Maybe some of you will bring those gatherings back. Maybe one day we'll meet there. Until then, this is Kristin reminding you one last time, you know what to do. Now go do it.